when the blinding alien tractor beam sucked Marcus, along with the greasy anti-slip floor mat right out from under his boots, into the interstellar gladiatorial arena. His left hand was still dead steady, gripping a vat of boiling, industrial-grade fryer oil that had just hit its smoke point. A 3 a.m. Waffle House in Atlanta. Don't employ no lightweights. 5 minutes ago, Head just physically baptized 2 method-up armed robbers with a cast-iron skillet. Right now, the only thing on his mind was the double order of scattered and smothered hash browns he still needed to run out to a trucker. Outside the holographic energy barrier, tens of thousands of alien aristocrats were furiously laying bets on their newly imported carbon-based gladiator. Inside the barrier, 3 interstellar executioners, fully decked out in super-alloy armor, were swinging plasma warhammers and letting out deafening roars. Marcus squinted his grease-smoke-reddened eyes, took a sniff of the slightly thin oxygen in the sealed chamber, and irritably slapped the filthy rag from his shoulder down onto his thigh. "You dumbasses ain't even got the basic exhaust fans running," he muttered, his right hand naturally dropping to unholster the 6-pound cast-iron griddle scraper from his waist. To a Waffle House night shift cook, any species that hasn't survived the trial by fire of a weekend, 2 a.m. drunk rush ain't nothing but a bunch of sheltered little snowflakes. The lead executioner charged fastest. Its plasma warhammer dragged a searing pale blue contrail, the heavy backdraft of the swing flattening the stray hairs against Marcus' forehead. The raw stench hitting his face was ranker than the trucker who'd blitzed the kitchen last week after downing 3 dozen shots of corn whiskey. Marcus' boots stayed planted on that greasy, earth-born floor mat, not budging a single damn inch. 12 years of flipping pans gave his wrist a muscle memory flick, sending the entire vat of 400-degree boiling grease in a perfect golden arc. It poured flawlessly into the fine metal ventilation grills under the jaw of the alien's helmet. Head perfected that aim over a decade. Back in the day, he could splash the back of a drunk's hand from 10 feet away without getting a single drop on the last bacon waffle. The scalding liquid bypassed the armor plating completely, seeping through the vents without giving the bastard even a tenth of a second to buffer. Billowing white steam, reeking of scorched proteins, instantly erupted from the cold blue seams of the helmet. The executioner's plasma hammer locked up at the apex of its swing. Its super-alloy-clad body violently convulsed, like it was hooked up to a high-voltage line, heavy combat boots gouging 3 teeth grinding white streaks into the metal deck. The 2 backups on his 6 froze 3 steps away. Their arms hung suspended mid-swing, their built-in tactical prediction algorithms completely bricked by an attack that didn't exist in any of their shiny corporate databases. Marcus casually chucked the empty fryer vat at his feet. The heavy iron bottom clanged with a dull thud. He scowled, spitting out a drop of grease the wind had blown to the corner of his mouth, his eyes locked dead cold onto the executioner, whose helmet seams were now oozing a foul slurry of hot oil and liquefied flesh. High above, Zinn twirled a crystal glass of fluorescent blue star marrow wine between his fingertips. The biogems embedded in his knuckles still carried the fine dust of credit chips won from the last betting pool. Behind him in the viewing gallery, the syndicate's corporate aristocrats were cackling, dumping chips into the open pot. Half of them had slammed their money on the highest yield prop bet, human torn to shreds within 3 rounds. Holographic chat streams spammed the screens with filthy insults mocking the captive from a primitive, low-tier civilization. The next second, a shrieking alarm shattered the command console. Zinn's wine sloshed straight onto a nebula velvet rug, worth tens of thousands of credits. He threw himself at the primary display, maxing out the zoom. On screen, his custom-built, top-of-the-line interstellar executioner, a unit Head poured a fortune into, was thrashing on the floor in absolute agony. Boiling oil, chunky with translucent proteins, bubbled out of its helmet vents. The biometrics inside the hermetically sealed armor were nosediving in real time. That 400-degree liquid had flooded the exhaust grates and was literally deep-frying the soft tissue inside the alien skull, melting its neural interfaces into a gooey lump of useless slag. A sudden chill spiked down Zin's spine. He had programmed those superalloy suits with the known attack vectors of over 100 civilizations. They had defense modules for everything from plasma beam scorching to antimatter shrapnel penetration. Absolutely no one told him some lunatic might chuck boiling fry grease into the exhaust vents. Panicking, he flicked to the telemetry of the other two executioners. The tactical prediction logs of these supposedly fearless killing machines were flashing critical red. Their pre-programmed routines were caught in an endless loop, failing to even authorize the motor command to lift a foot. They just stood there, rigid as two electrified lumps of scrap metal. Grinding his back teeth, Zin reached to smash the emergency purge button. Then, his pupils shrank to pinpricks. Down in the center of the arena, the human was moving. A hand clad in a grease-stained apron reached straight down for the plasma warhammer at his feet, its head still radiating thermal energy. Marcus' greasy palm clamped around the grip of the plasma warhammer. The residual heat bleeding through the charred thermal wrapping stung the thick calluses on his hand. The waste oil smeared on the leather sizzled against the heat, puffing up wisps of pale blue smoke. The two remaining interstellar executioners were still frozen. The dying screams from their buddies' comms had effectively deep-fried half their tactical processing chips. Splattered grease clung to the exposed sensor wires in their armor gaps, curling the insulation back into charred, crispy edges and turning their targeting motions into a stuttering slideshow. Marcus didn't even spare these dumbasses a sideways glance. Moving exactly like he was sidestepping a loudmouth drunk, blocking the pickup window at 3 a.m., his steps were grounded and heavy. He hefted the 50-pound warhammer one-handed without a wobble, making a beeline for the arena edge. Had been eyeing the primary liquid nitrogen cooling pipe over there for 3 whole minutes. That pipe was thick enough to shove 2 full-grown men inside, crusted in a thick, permanent layer of white frost. It was the core circulation line cooling the entire holographic energy barrier. Zin and his cheapskate alien buddies hadn't even bothered slapping a crash guard on it to save a few bucks. Marcus dropped his center of gravity. The warhammer whipped in a vicious half-arc, trailing a red-hot plasma shadow. Wham! The first strike caved the half-inch alloy casing right in. Bang! The second shattered the welded flange into a shower of metal shrapnel. A wave of gasps washed over the tens of thousands of syndicate spectators, and Zin's hysterical screaming bled through the barrier's low-frequency dampeners. Marcus didn't bat a damn eye. He put his entire back into the third swing, channeling pure, unfiltered brute force into the hammerhead. The entire pressure-bearing structure snapped cleanly, sending the jammed blowout valve flying 10 feet with a deafening clang. Tens of thousands of kilopascals of ultra-cryogenic fluid hissed out of the rupture in a blinding jet of white vapor. Only then did the two executioners, after glitching out for a solid 30 seconds, finally force their heavy superalloy frames into gear, snapping their rigid helmets toward him. Marcus sidestepped 2 big paces out of the way, dodging the wave of liquid nitrogen aimed right for his face. The searing burn in his palm from the hammer instantly shrank back under the biting, bone-deep cold. The ultra-cold medium slammed into the 2 freshly rebooted executioners like a white tsunami. Half of their shoulder plating was still cooking from the ambient heat of the splattered grease, the superalloy surfaces sitting pretty at nearly 400 degrees. When that minus 320 degree Fahrenheit liquid nitrogen hit them, the entire outer shell erupted into a violent cacophony of cracking and popping. Marcus stared down those 2 expensive chunks of alien hardware. He watched the stress fractures crawl out from their seized joints like smashed tempered glass. In the blink of an eye, the webbing spread across their chest plates, helmets, and leg guards. Even the fancy syndicate logos etched into their pauldrons shattered and sloughed right off. The executioners' drive motors squealed like a blown transmission. The specialized lube in their joints instantly froze into jagged ice. They couldn't so much as lift their weapons, paralyzed in place while sub-zero coolant and pale blue alien blood leaked out of the cracked armor panels. The roar of tens of thousands of alien spectators died instantly, like somebody yanked the plug. A faint siren drifted over from the command deck. Marcus weighed the still-warm plasma hammer in his grip, his eyes scanning 3 steps away to his trusty 6-pound cast-iron scraper, currently lying on the anti-slip mat beneath a thin layer of frost. He casually tossed the plasma hammer aside. The heavy block of alien tech slammed into the frosted deck, denting it with a heavy thud. He hooked his fingers around the wooden handle of his griddle scraper. His body heat immediately melted the frost off the edge, leaving his knuckles coated in cold, slick water. He locked eyes with the 2 executioners, their armor compromised like frostbitten safety glass. His stance was unshakable, rooted with the stamina of 12 straight hours on the line. The angle of his swing was as precise as chopping through bone and pork chops on a 3 a.m. rush order. The first strike slammed hard into the widest crack on the left executioner's shoulder joint. No flashy sci-fi martial arts, just pure, kinetic, blue-collar torque driven straight from the hips. The super alloy splintered with a brutal crunch. A geyser of pale blue alien blood shot through the breach, splattering across half his face. Before the paralyzed husk even had time to tip over, he recovered, twisted, and brought the iron down a second time. It chopped cleanly into the spiderweb fractures of the right executioner's helmet. The massive concussive force channeled straight through the armor gaps into the inner cavity. The alien's skull inside pulverized instantly, and the sparking electrical fires of its neural interfaces blinked out in less than a second. He threw a boot up and kicked both dead-weight armor suits over. They rolled right next to the corpse of the first guy, head deep-fried. 3 scrapped interstellar executioners, lined up nice and neat like prime cuts of meat, waiting to be deboned. The stadium above him finally erupted in sheer, panicked hysteria. The sirens on the command deck pitched up 3 octaves, and the edges of the holographic barrier began flashing a furious, overloaded red. The screeching alarms spiked straight into Zin's skull. Dozens of holographic monitors flashed critical, the error codes for the overloaded barrier scrolling faster than the VIG from his casino floors. His knuckles, still clutching the fluorescent wine glass, blanched a sickly alien gray. The sight of those neatly arranged piles of ruined superalloy burned his retinas. 3 top-of-the-line interstellar executioners, each suit worth half a colony world's annual tax revenue, were now nothing but cracked scrap metal beaten down by a blunt instrument, their core circuitry turned to dust. The absolute bloodbath he had personally guaranteed his VIPs was now a sector-wide laughingstock. The boos and shrieks of tens of thousands of syndicate elites flooded the public comm channels, shaking loose a shower of metal dust from the control room ceiling. A physiological terror seized Zin's spine. He had lived for over 300 years and hosted over 100 gladiatorial blood sports, and he had never, ever seen anyone hack apart the hardest superalloy in the galaxy like a rack of frozen ribs. He couldn't afford to waste another second. His fingers flew across the console, violently slamming the kill switch for the lower deck's primary lighting. Smack! The arena plunged from broad daylight into a static-filled, murky crimson. Snatching up his comms unit, he roared into the channel of his 10-man elite mercenary squad, ordering an immediate tactical breach to purge the target. He gripped the radio so hard he left dents in the alloy frame. Pressing his face against the freezing monitor, Zin watched the bright red thermal blip representing Marcus pause for half a second in the pitch-black arena before slowly inching his way toward the lateral bulkhead. The alien blood on Marcus' face had crusted into a thin, frozen shell from the creeping chill. The burn in his palm fought a losing battle against the frostbite seeping into his bones. His fingertips brushed the frosted bulkhead, unerringly finding the loose maintenance bolt that the 3 executioners had rattled free during their initial charge. Jamming the 6-pound iron scraper into the gap as a makeshift crowbar, he cranked his wrist. With a loud clack, the rusted pressure hatch popped open, venting a blast of hot motor oil-scented air straight into his face. This mothership's labyrinth of exhaust shafts was a hell of a lot roomier than the grease traps Head spent 3 years snaking out back home. He could damn near stand up straight and walk, without having to hunch over like a pretzel. He bunched up the greasy floor mat and wedged it into the pipe's intake rim as a buffer. The empty fryer vat dangled off his hip, clanging with every step. He kept the blue-stained scraper glued to his right hand, dragging the still-warm plasma hammer behind him, the metal haft throwing sparks off the ventilation walls. Behind him, the heavy thud of armored combat boots on the frosted deck echoed into the shaft. The shrill barks of syndicate mercenaries echoed through the ductwork, while faint red sweeps of infrared lasers cut through the grates at his back. The bastards were tracking the half-footprints Head left in the frost. He hustled forward 20 paces in a low crouch. Suddenly, warm amber light bled through the vent slats up ahead. A cloyingly sweet, syrupy smell flooded the air. The engine bay supply depot was sitting pretty less than 2 feet past the grate. Marcus didn't hesitate. Gripping his trusty scraper, he torqued his thick core and threw a brutal kick. Wham! The flimsy metal grate popped right off its hinges. He rolled into the supply depot, hauling the plasma warhammer right in with him. That sickeningly sweet syrup stench smacked him right in the face. Looking up, he saw waist-high pressure sacks stacked uniformly on climate-controlled shelves, stamped with the Syndicate's universal nutrition label. He tasted a pinch. It was 10 times more potent than the premium maple syrup they poured back at the diner, essentially 99% pure, high-yield glucose powder. The clanking of armor soon echoed from the tunnel entrance. The hunters had reached his last location. Infrared beams cut through the gloom into the edges of the depot. He ducked to the shelves, burying the iron scraper deep into the seam of a top-tier sack. With a flick of the wrist, he ripped a 2-foot gash in it. Brilliant white dust poured out with a whoosh, catching the engine room's circulation fans and rapidly coating the entire chamber. He worked faster than a Saturday 3 a.m. rush, cooking 200 scattered waffles. He slashed open dozens of pressure bags in quick succession. In less than 30 seconds, the entire bay was choked with a massive, floating cloud of airborne sugar dust. Even the frosted shell of blue blood on his face was caked in thick white. He wedged his empty fryer pot right behind the main intake fan, blocking the bulk of the powder from blowing backward into the duct. Didn't want these brain-dead goons sniffing out the trap before they even walked through the door. Trap set. He slipped across the slick, sugary floor and hunkered down in the blind spot behind the engine bay's blast door. His fingers grazed the residual warmth of an exposed plasma line beside him. He heard the first heavy thud of armor dropping from the vent. The 10 elite mercs had breached in standard tactical formation, their boots crunching on the sugar-dusted floor as they pushed methodically deeper into the room. Zinn pinched his half-empty glass of glowing booze, his knuckles flushed in alien lavender from the strain. His eyes were glued to the infrared monitors. The 10 bright red dots of his elite squad were stutter-stepping their way into the depths of the supply bay, their formation totally shot to hell. Head just opened a fresh betting pool with the VIP bookies standing nearby, laying down 20-to-1 odds that this fully kitted hit squad would shred the human in under 30 seconds. Blinding stacks of energy credits piled up on the rim of his console. But when he switched the feed to optical spectrum, he froze solid. The entire bay was dense with a hyper-suspended bright white powder. Under the warm amber ceiling lights, it looked like a blizzard of corrupted data fragments. He ran it against every known combat material in the Syndicate database and got absolutely 0 hits. The static from the squad's comms flared up. One merc griped that the floor was slicker than hull grease. Another complained his thermal sights were blinded by white static, unable to paint even a sliver of the human's heat signature. Cold sweat beaded on the back of Zinn's neck. A primal, unexplainable panic choked his throat. He just couldn't wrap his head around why some low-tier, line-cooked carbon life form would bust his ass blowing useless white dust all over the room. He furiously smashed his glowing wine glass. His shrill roar blasted into every mercenary's earpiece. Screw formation. Open fire immediately. Blanket sweep every shadow. Burn it all down. The 10 red dots on the monitor halted in unison. 10 plasma rifles snapped up, their charge indicators chaining into a blinding blue-white sequence. The very first spark of ultra-heated plasma was a millisecond away from exiting the muzzle. Huddled tight in the blast door's blind spot, Marcus didn't even bother looking at the flashing muzzles. Back at the 24-hour Waffle House he ran in Atlanta, spilling half a bag of powdered sugar in the dry storage could trip the fire alarms. These corporate syndicate morons, who'd probably never even seen a naked open flame, had absolutely no damn clue what they were pulling the trigger on. The point man's finger depressed the trigger with a click. The instant the first tenth of an inch of 10,000-degree plasma cleared the barrel, the hyper-dense cloud of high-purity glucose dust ignited. A zero-warning concussive thoom ruptured the air, painfully rattling Marcus' eardrums. A split second later, an apocalyptic wave of orange-white hellfire tore across every square inch of the bulkheads. It was a raw, consuming heat, 10,000 times meaner than splash back from a deep fryer full of donut grease, and it instantly swallowed the 10 figures standing dead center in the room. He slapped his filthy rag over his face, shrinking another half-inch into the steel doorframe. The death shrieks from the mercenaries' comms barely registered before they were vaporized into silence. High-pressure lines ruptured off the walls in droves. The shockwave tore metal panels free, flinging them in every direction. Even the banged-up fryer pot wedged in the vent hopped a good 2 feet in the air. The massive casino mothership violently listed to one side. Every load-bearing strut shrieked in near failure. Blinding, retina-scorching plasma fire spewed through the cracks of the blast door. Marcus could feel the alloy floor under his boots trembling violently as huge chunks of structural metal rained down from the ceiling with a whistling roar. The second the orange-white wave slammed into the back of the blast door, Marcus' work shirt began to smoke. He buried his rag-covered face into his arms, the light bleeding through his fingers still sharp enough to sting his eyes. The 10,000-degree blast wave chewed through the metal of every seam in the room. 9 syndicate mercs hadn't even managed a half scream before they, and their super alloy armor, were utterly vaporized, leaving nothing but puddles of pale blue scorch marks on the slagged floor. The whole mothership tilted hard. Marcus dug his toes into the deck's traction plating. The still warm plasma hammer beside him clattered against the steel, sending a phantom throb through the burn on his palm. A red-hot I-beam dropped from above, totally collapsing a 1.5 foot thick bulkhead on impact. He waited until the heat wave bleeding through the doorframe dropped by half before lowering the dirty rag a fraction of an inch. The exposed skin on his jaw was still crusted in a frozen shell of blue alien blood, shedding flakes mixed with powdered sugar. He scanned the devastated bay. The squad leader was the sole survivor, half buried under a collapsed bulkhead. The merc's portable emergency shield was burnt into a slagged lump of plastic, both legs crushed at the root by deformed armor. Blue blood pooled everywhere, while the alien shrieked in inhuman agony, a security keycard on its belt blinking a steady pale blue. The 6-pound cast iron scraper pressed white indentations into his palm. Marcus rolled his stiff ankles. The bundled floor mat tumbled down the sloped deck and stopped at his boots, while his empty fryer pot vibrated on the scorched floor a few feet away. Pushing off the cold, hard steel of the blast door, he slowly rose to his feet. A dab of melted caramel sugar stuck to the burn on his palm. Sticky as hell. He swapped the iron scraper to his other hand and walked, his boots crunching over alloy slag that had flash melted and rehardened, kicking up clouds of black carbon ash with every step. Seeing Marcus approach, the pinned syndicate captain choked out a stream of gibberish pleas, his one good hand trembling as it reached for a sidearm. Marcus didn't bother with small talk. He lifted his boot and stomped down hard on the alien's wrist. Snap. The guy spasmed in sheer agony, his scream catching in his throat. He bent over, hooking a finger under the lanyard of the blue blinking keycard. With a light tug, he ripped the cold plastic free, taking a glob of gooey alien bodily fluids with it. Disgusted, Marcus wiped the card clean on the merc's remaining pauldron and held it up. The blue light washed over his blood-crusted jawline as a soft unlocked chime hummed in his ear. The fryer pot at his feet was still vibrating from the aftershocks. The warm plasma hammer leaned against a blackened bulkhead a few yards away, and the greasy floor mat swayed where it was jammed in the vent. Marcus holstered the scraper at the small of his back and marched toward the top-level biomagnetic security elevator just up ahead. His blue-stained boots left a crooked, wet trail on the metal deck. He slapped the keycard against the scanner. The dead panel immediately lit up, floor indicators sequencing upward to level 12. Simultaneously, a silent, top-tier authorization alert pinged in the corner of Zin's holographic display back in the command room. Zin was just pinching a blinding 20-to-1 energy coin, ready to dial the bookies and cash out his massive winnings, when he caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. 9 of the red dots representing his elite squad had literally blinked into oblivion. 3 seconds later, the last one faded to black. Then, that ghost-like, unauthorized top-level clearance alert silently popped into the corner of his screen. He snapped his head up to the elevator panel. The darkened floor indicators were jumping toward him. 11, 10, 9. With every lit number, Zin's spine iced over another inch. Before it even hit level 7, his legs gave out completely. He collapsed onto the freezing alloy floor, his fistful of credits scattering like loose change and rolling into the dark beneath the console. He began shrieking at the top of his lungs. The 2 personal bodyguards posted at the door fumbled their nutrition tubes, lunging for the half-meter-thick steel blast door to slam the lockdown button. The heavy-duty deadbolts ratcheted into place with a deep, echoing clunk, bathing the entire door in red security lights. Zin frantically grabbed his comms, screaming a promise of triple hazard pay over the Interstellar Guard's public channel. His voice cracked terribly like a ruptured plasma line, begging them to breach the room and rip this lunatic apart before the elevator arrived. He watched the elevator hit level 2. Backpedaling, he knocked over an entire cabinet of VIP alien liquor, crashing glass and pooling blue-purple wine over the soles of his boots. Right at that moment, the first sharp, high-pitched ZZT of an electrical arc hissed from the hinges of the heavy blast door. Embers still smoldered on the smoking fabric of Marcus' work shirt. The burn in his palm throbbed in time with his grip as he shoved a stripped high-voltage copper core, yanked straight from the engine bay's ducts, deep into the hinges of the blast door. Tens of thousands of volts chewed right through the superalloy facing. The sizzling was deafening. Brilliant white arcs spewed from the seams, followed by dripping strings of molten red iron. When the slag hit the spilled blue-purple wine, it flashed into choking clouds of acidic vapor. The 2 syndicate bodyguards on the other side hacked and coughed, blindly firing their plasma rifles into the door in sheer panic. High-yield bolts blew charred craters into the steel, not even grazing a thread of Marcus' clothes on the other side. The 6-pound scraper dug into his lower back. The warm warhammer leaned at his feet. With the blue keycard in one hand, he counted down the rhythm of the softening metal in the hinges, stepping back 3 large paces. He dropped his waist and squared his shoulders, moving exactly like he did at the end of every shift when he had to bash through a stack of dirty bus tubs blocking the fire exit. Throwing every single ounce of his body weight into his right shoulder, he rammed dead center into the compromised blast door. Trailing the last few ribbons of liquid iron, the half-meter-thick slab of steel collapsed with a massive boom. It flattened the 2 bodyguards square in the chest, caving their superalloy armor into deep craters. Their eyes rolled back, knocked cold before they could even scream, their rifles clattering into the wine. Marcus shook out his numb wrist. His eyes swept over the scattered energy coins and smashed liquor cabinets, locking dead onto the pathetic lump that was Zin, cowering behind the command console. The edge of the cast-iron scraper glinted with residual blood under the emergency lights. Zin trembled, fumbling for the plasma pistol at his waist, but his fingers were too limp to even flick off the safety. That 10,000 credit aristocrat's sidearm might as well have been a lead weight. Marcus stood right over him. His work shirt still sparked with embers, the shell of blue blood on his jaw fracturing, his eyes still bloodshot from the flashover. Carrying the lingering chill of cold metal, the 6-pound scraper pressed flush against Zin's exposed carotid artery. The razor's sharp edge only needed a flick of the wrist to sever the alien's bioelectric supply forever. "You can't kill me." Zin's vocal cords vibrated like a pinched reed. "The interstellar guard is 8 minutes out. You'll never get away." Marcus didn't wait for him to finish his whining. His free hand shoved the alien's face hard into the main touchscreen console, pinning him with enough force to crack his horned cheekbones. "Punch in the warp coordinates for Earth. Full power." He lifted his wrist. The cheap digital watch sporting a Waffle House logo glowed with a cold light. It read 5:58 a.m. He spat out a chunk of grease smoke residue and spoke in a tone as flat as calling out an order on the line. 6 a.m. "I'm punching out." The warp drive spooling hum instantly resonated through the entire casino cruiser. Outside, the tens of thousands of syndicate elites who'd watched the whole show on the holographic feeds fell into absolute stunned silence. Every single betting ledger zeroed out in 0.1 seconds. The behemoth gambling mothership swung its bow around, burning full throttle toward the Sol system. Zin slumped back into his freezing command chair, only one mind-breaking thought looping through his head. The interstellar gladiator empire head, spent 300 years building, had just been hijacked, lock, stock, and barrel, by a graveyard shift Waffle House line cook.
Writing this story was an absolute blast from start to finish. The core inspiration actually stemmed from a wildly absurd question. What is the most terrifying and hostile environment an advanced alien civilization could ever encounter? It's not a heavily fortified military base, nor is it a squad of elite space marines. No, it's a Waffle House in Atlanta at 3 a.m. on a Saturday. I wanted to deconstruct the classic humanity. Fuck yeah! HFY genre through a purely blue-collar working-class lens. Our protagonist, Marcus, isn't a genetically modified supersoldier. He is just a chronically exhausted, underpaid night shift line cook who is deeply, profoundly unimpressed by chaos. There is a very specific kind of invincibility earned by surviving the graveyard shift in the food service industry. When your muscle memory involves dodging a chair thrown by a raging drunk while simultaneously flipping a perfect double order of hashbrowns, a super alloy alien gladiator swinging a plasma hammer doesn't inspire awe. To Marcus, they just look like another batch of unruly non-tipping customers crowding the pickup window. The comedy and the ultimate triumph of this story lie in that extreme contrast. You have the hyper-sterile, over-engineered, and incredibly expensive technology of the alien syndicate slamming face-first into the gritty, raw, cast-iron reality of human survival, translating the chaotic, kinetic energy of a short-order kitchen into a sci-fi battlefield was an incredibly fun experiment. Pouring 400-degree boiling oil into armored ventilation grills, weaponizing hyper-pure glucose into a thermobaric dust bomb, or hacking through million-credit armor with a 6-pound griddle scraper. These aren't calculated military tactics. They are the brutal, practical, and lethal improvisations of a man who only cares about one thing: clocking out exactly at 6 a.m. At its core, this story is an unconventional love letter, written in motor oil, sweat, and cheap coffee, to the night shift workers of the world. Beneath the dark humor and sci-fi tropes, it's a reminder that the terrifying resilience and adaptability of humanity isn't always forged in a polished Starfleet academy. Sometimes, it's hardened over a sizzling, grease-stained griddle in the dead of night.